Welcome back to IGN's History of Awesome, a year-by-year breakdown of big events that shape pop culture. 1996 was a big year. That was when Nintendo released the Nintendo 64 and blew us all away with the 3D platforming of Super Mario 64. Over on PlayStation, Resident Evil gave life to the survival horror genre, and an archaeologist named Lara Croft raided her first tomb. Let's reminisce about these events and more as we look back on the year 1996.
Welcome back to the History of Awesome. The year we're talking about is 1996. It's a fantastic year for video games, also a surprisingly strong year for action movies. Joining me this year is Per Schneider,
hello,
Jose Otero,
what's going on,
and Sam Claiborne.
Hey, listen.
Hey, listen. Guys, one of the first things we have to talk about in 1996 is the launch of the Nintendo 64.
Oh, man.
I'm going to assume that this is something that was very important to all four of us. It was certainly hugely important and influential in my life.
You could say it was formative for us here at IGN because N64.com, of course, was our very first website, and I joined right when, after the website kicked off on IGN, and that's all I covered.
Yeah.
Was
So
N64
you were writing
every day.
for N64.com, which
That's right.
covered the Nintendo 64, but then that became IGN64.com.
Eventually, at some point, Nintendo said, you know what, I think we want that domain name.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Yeah, when they said they
Nintendo's a stickler for like certain kind of spelling and writing. They spelled it Nintendo, all caps, 64TM, right? We started calling it the N64, and fans on the internet and other websites sprung up with that kind of abbreviation. And after a while, Nintendo trademarked that. It actually wasn't a trademark.
It's funny how
And then
abbreviations weren't even around then.
Yeah, they actually worked with us. They were really good about it. We
was gonna ask,
redirected
cool.
the
Yeah.
N64.com domain to our website and theirs at the same time.
But was it easy to like get information and screenshots and things you needed
No.
for a website in 1996?
No, we got stuff on slides. I kid you not.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
So I remember the Nintendo 64 being in kiosks, in toy stores. That was the first place I experienced it. It was in Nintendo Power, it was in toy stores. That's how I played it. I bet you had a different experience of that because you were in the industry at the time.
Well, so let's take it back up. The console did launch on September 29th, was the official US launch day, and it was $250 at the time. But lots of people were already a little bit hyped for it. It was pretty standard, but yeah, I mean, that's not a small chunk of change. And a lot of people had a chance to sort of play that console, mostly at Toys R Us. And like Sam's saying, your experience might have been a little bit different.
Actually, no. I joined after it had already debuted in the U.S. and I had the Japanese import as well.
Yeah.
So I experienced it first as a consumer as well. Playing Mario 64.
Yeah.
But do you remember, like, it was also a controversy for me on the playground or whatever. I guess I didn't have, well, I was probably middle school.
Little kid with a mustache.
Yeah.
Like,
But
teased.
because it didn't come with a game. So even though it was $250, it also didn't come with a Mario game. And like to have a Nintendo game without a Mario game was strange. Although the Game Boy had done that, but
it's pretty standard now. Although, obviously the Wii came with a pack-in console.
Yeah.
It's not uncommon to not get a game with a console now, but the N64, right, it's $250, but it's not really $250. It's really more like $310, $320 to get, what you need
and then
to
at
actually
least
experience.
it had a giant Mario game at launch, though.
Right.
Because that has not been standardized since then.
Yeah.
And like we had Mario World and Super Mario Brothers before that with
Yeah.
the big systems, but man, to get a massive Mario game to show off the new system, that was the way to do it. And I really missed that.
And if you remember the time then, right, like the moment, like you saw the PlayStation obviously was the hot thing, right? It had the CD drive and, really kind of more modern games, like games that are more like what games are today. And Mario 64 was this kind of throwback, cartoonish game. But then you saw it running for the first time and like, rock solid walls, no twitching textures and pixels. It looked like a new generation of games when we saw it.
It was like Lawnmower Man. It's like being inside Lawnmower Man.
We're going to talk a little bit more about Mario
It's a
64
VR
in a
joke.
second. I want to make sure we sort of cover the hardware. The Nintendo 64 hardware was, strange isn't the right word, but it was definitely maybe the first case of Nintendo going off and doing their own thing. Everyone's going to go this direction, Nintendo's going to go this other direction. And in some ways it worked, and in other ways it didn't. I think it's really notable that it had 4 controller ports that became hugely important for games
Not at
like
launch.
GoldenEye later on. But at launch, it wasn't such a big deal. It had, ports on the top and the bottom to expand the console in different ways. That
And one was actually used. Like the Super Nintendo and the NES both had console expansion ports too, but the RAM port was actually used on that.
Well, and the bottom, and in Japan you could get the 64DD and you could use the bottom port as well.
That's right, and the controller itself, of course, had the Rumble Pack expansion area and a memory card, which didn't make sense because you could put memory on, you could do saves on a cartridge.
Well,
But
not to
only
overlook, hang on,
first party.
But not to overlook, there was also the analog, which I think we weren't used to a console, at least at that time, that shipped with an analog stick and had, I mean, Mario 64 was an excellent display of that technology. Because if you moved it slightly, he sort of walked. If you took off, he ran off sprinting.
That console was crazy, right?
Yeah,
like it wasn't obviously the
know.
analog stick was hugely innovative. You know, it was before the PlayStation dual analog. You know, the first sort of mainstream mass market time that analog controls had been in, you know, millions of people's hands and was displayed perfectly with games like Mario 64. The C stick was a big deal. You know, that three-prong.
Yeah, but I will say that my biggest challenge with it at first, though, was how am I supposed to hold this?
Oh my gosh!
And I remember seeing diagrams of different ways to hold it. And I'm just like, how do you play video games?
People got confused. You saw so many people trying to reach over to the middle prong, trying to get to the analog stick, and it was painful. So they had like these little line drawings, if you remember, on the manuals, on the boxes. You could see it's like, no, hold it like this, hold it like this. By the way, very few games had you hold the analog stick with the right hand and then the D-pad.
But some GoldenEye players played that way.
I mean, they had like faux dual analog controls, you know, years before people had really accepted that as the way that shooters.
Which is the irony. Now you control the camera with the right hand. But you know, when Turok came out, you used the digital buttons for movement and the left for look. So we flipped it.
Yeah, let's not overlook the Z trigger, right? Because that was another thing that maybe at launch wasn't super like useful or successful.
It felt great with Mario though.
Yeah, but when Zelda came out, that was the proving ground for the Z targeting. And just the idea that I can quickly snap onto something.
It doesn't interfere with your fingers while you're targeted.
Yeah, it also felt like a gun trigger, right? Like you're holding it, so first-person shooters actually felt really good on the machine as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was maybe the first example of Nintendo, you know, marrying that marriage of hardware and software, and we're going to make games that are perfectly designed to work with this controller. And the first example of third parties, some figured it out and others didn't. You know, just like Nintendo off doing their own thing. It was, I mean, the decision to include carts.
Not a popular one at the time. Even before the machine came out, there was a lot of, you know, mumbling, not just in the press, but among the licensees, among the companies making games for the consoles of the time. They were not happy. And you saw that with Square, right? When I was covering N64, Final Fantasy VII was still an N64 game. We saw these renders and these little cinematics. And you know, Square was talking about how it'll be a much bigger game with bigger score and everything. And then it got quiet, and then it turned into a PlayStation game because it was impossible to do the game they wanted to do on the cartridge.
Well, and it looked completely different. And over time, we would eventually discover that the Nintendo 64, at least from a system architecture perspective, was extremely limiting for developers. It was like when Sony put out their PlayStation, they actually had a system that was easier to develop for. At least history has proven that, given the volume of games that went on there. I don't think that was just because of the cartridge. It was also the system itself.
I mean, it's a combination of things. Those carts are so expensive to manufacture.
Yeah, but there was also there was an expectation that the N64 hardware had just more oomph, better fill rate, you know, like just could render more polygons. And when we saw the first kind of like, they weren't called vertical slices, but they were kind of concept demos of what the games were going to look like. You know, from Pilot Wings to Goemon from Konami and Castlevania. All these games looked way too complex and couldn't be pulled off on the N64. So when you actually got the Mystical Ninja Goemon game, it was a shadow of what we had first
Quest
seen.
64. There's like a laundry list.
They were designing this for like silicon graphics, you know, bigger machines, and it just didn't work out.
In the end, I was so happy that it's on cartridge because load times killed that generation of disc.
It's odd how different.
And FMV was horrible.
I mean, when you think about
that's what was out at the time.
In the modern day, you know, the 360 and the PS3 have their differences, the Xbox One and the PS4, but they're very similar consoles. It's weird to remember back to an era where they were wildly different. Like the N64 and PS1 are like, you do get these weird benefits. Like I'd kind of forgotten that you never really needed memory cards on the N64, and I remember shuffling memory cards around on the PS1.
Oh my gosh, the PS1.
Well, you guys say that, but every third-party game, it was a high cost to include the EEPROM, right? Like it was too expensive.
I mean, I had a card, I just didn't use it much.
But there's interesting things.
I had like 10 of these damn like third-party memory packs, and they were tiny and horrible.
You were working in the industry at the time.
You get these, there's these trade-offs. Like the sound was higher quality on the PS1, but sound on the N64, since it used these MIDI files, could be remixed and changed on the fly. It wasn't just streaming a single audio track. So you would see that in later games like Banjo-Kazooie, which I think we'll talk about in future episodes.
In Mario, they used Boo's chuckle is the same sound effect as Bowser's laugh.
wow.
But it's sampled. It's the same sample. It just it either sounds like that or sped up.
Yeah.
Nice.
So the N64 was a modest success. It ended up being significantly outsold by the PS1, but at launch, that console launched incredibly strong, and it actually held its own for a while, and then eventually through the lens of time,
and it was able to react
up
against the 32X, the Sega CD, and the PlayStation, and be like, let's not do that.
Yeah.
And that's really why it existed in such a weird way.
Well, yeah, and to its credit, I mean, that system was Nintendo's third generation home console.
Yeah.
Like, they had made no mistakes up until that, at least in the home console space. There was the oddity that was Virtual Boy, but history just kind of wrote that thing off, and it was like, well, there's no way it's going to affect their home console business. They know what they're doing, and then over time we found out, well, this is a cool system, and there are some cool games for it, but history doesn't really remember the N64 as fondly.
Being in the industry at that time, what we heard from a lot of third parties was that that it was a gamble to make games for N64, right?
Sure.
Like with a CD-ROM based system, you design your game, you have the cost of game development, and then you're getting ready to press the discs, and they're very cheap to make.
Sure.
What you had to do with the N64, you had to go through Nintendo. Nintendo had to manufacture the cartridges at 15 to 20 times the cost of a CD, but you had to actually put in an order for a certain set of carts.
Right.
So you had to take this gamble. You'd have to
a
say,
big
all
investment.
right, Harvest Moon 64 will sell 100,000 copies, therefore I order 100,000 carts. If you didn't sell them, you had the expense and didn't make your money back. And so a couple of third parties, especially in Japan, went out of business because of miscalculations on the cartridge model.
Yeah, I will say, just to go back to the hardware for a second, I don't remember a single home console that had so many different colors, so many different styles. Than the N64. I feel like that was the first
Pikachu version.
Pikachu version. It came in purple. It came in
blue.
gold.
Yeah, over time they sort of took that Apple approach
controllers.
of like in the 90s, doing something
Oh
similar.
yeah, totally. Yeah, there was like something like 60 or 70 permutations of the controller color. I've seen them all lined up. It's amazing.
Yeah, and you got to say, I mean, that is the machine. Like, add-ons haven't always succeeded, right? Like, we know Sega's history, but the RAM expansion actually was a big success, and it got bundled in later with games. But that was another eye-opening moment in my career, seeing Turok 2 for the first time, and they say, by the way, check this out. With the RAM expansion, we can make it HD. Well, high-res with a Z was a claims term.
High-res.
And we're like, wow, this looks so much better than any other game on the market.
We do. I mean, we actually have to spend a little bit of time talking about Mario 64. Maybe the best launch game ever. I mean, Super Mario World.
Yeah.
Super Mario Brothers, Super Mario World, give it a run for its money.
I think there is no
amazing.
limit to the amount of things we could say about Mario 64. But I mean, to me, what stands out is that it was the first, or at least strongest example of Nintendo reinventing Mario. Like, it wasn't about breaking bricks. Like, it was an exploration game. It was a puzzle game. Like, you were exploring this open world instead of just going left or right through a level. And Mario World had a little bit of that, but it was a very, very different feeling game, like a brave game for Nintendo to make.
Yeah, Mario World is very much a kind of like, you have a template, right? They have a tile set, and then they make these really clever and awesome levels with it, and like you learn how to fly with a cape and stuff.
Yeah.
Mario 64, there's a level where you're small and big, you change size, where the water levels go up and down. There's a level where you slow down, you can slow down time, and depending on what time you enter the level, the platforms move at different speeds. Like, they really, really push the envelope, not just with 3D space, but with like sizes and time. And I mean, it's just fantastic how creative they were, despite having to tackle camera control, 3D motion, all that for the first time, really.
Well, and if you look at it, like, I think one of the reasons for its success as well is just the strength in the early designs you saw. I mean, the first place you see is just an open space for you to jump around in and get the idea of the controls down. Then when you get to Bob-omb Battlefield, which is the first world you explore, it's also very safe.
That was pretty good.
Like, it doesn't try to overburden you with bottomless pits or anything like that. They just want you to get comfortable.
Very few enemies.
Yeah, running around that space and understanding how it plays. And then over time, they start taking that stuff away and making it more precision platforming, platforms that move, and you have to be very careful. So it's super cool.
To your point, I read, it's hard to tell when Super Mario Brothers came out. And there's the earliest review that's ever been discovered of Super Mario Brothers is in like a college journal. Yeah. And because it was like very strange and unpopular to have a Nintendo at the time. And it talks about how many secrets there are in the game and how that makes it great. Right. And when I think back, Mario wasn't a platformer for me as a kid. It was an exploration game. Sure. It was about discovering crazy stuff, a pipe that leads to another world, a warp zone, a brick that has a plant that comes out of it. Mario 64 is a game about secrets. Yeah. And some of them are so well hidden, that it adds this level of complexity to getting through a level is part of it, and then discovering secrets is the other part. And that's what I just love to death about it.
And it's a sandbox too, right? Like you could take that baby penguin and drop him off the edge of the world, right? Like
and there's a reaction
things,
to stuff like that.
Yep.
So do you guys remember that puzzle where you know there's the Switch Palaces?
Yeah.
Those are some of them are really easy to find. You go in there and you turn on Switch Palace. One of them, you have to go into the foyer and look up.
The first-person camera and look up into the light. What's that light
And
shining
the sun
down?
shines down and it unlocks one of the rooms.
Yeah.
Like,
No,
that
I
took
knew
a friend
flying.
of myself like
I was
a week
hooked
to figure out.
So this is true. I mean, Mario 64 is an important game to me because I was 11, 12 when this game came out when I was playing it. And that's the game that made me decide I wanted video games to be my career. And it's the moment where I found the secret slide. And like I'd played SNES games and NES games, but like video games were just a thing I did. And video games became my thing with Mario 64. Like that game was so special to me. And I spent so much time sort of poring over the star screen where it was like the checkbox of like what stars you have. And I love the music on that menu and figuring out like I'm missing 2 stars in Hazume's cave and I don't know where they are. You know, and sort of figuring all that out.
And history will remember, like for a lot of us, our first sort of 3D exploration adventure game was Tomb Raider. For me, it was. And you know, you had to basically do a math problem to move around in that game because you had to be so careful with how you sort of platformed. And when I first put my hands on Mario 64, I will never forget it because all of that wonky like strangeness just went out the window, and it was just this freedom
controls
of movement.
are Mario's moveset, you know, the cartwheels and the long jumps and the you know butt stomps and all that stuff just felt so good, so much better than a contemporary like Tomb Raider.
It's funny
or even
because of
Crash
the
Bandicoot.
well, because of the template, right? Tomb Raider, when it came out, was basically the original 2D Prince of Persia done in 3D, which meant when you're platforming, you have to decide way before you jump that you're going to jump, right? Like the character has to run through his animation. That's Prince of Persia with the rotoscope characters. That's how it worked. Tomb Raider worked the exact same way. If it had been faster, it would have looked really unnatural for like a a realistic, not by today's standards, but then for a realistic character to move like that. Mario, they didn't have to worry about any of that. They just had him jump on a dime, and that made such a great controlling experience, I think.
No,
So
absolutely.
a few months later, we would get our hands on. I always consider Mario Kart 64 as being early, but it was 5 months after the launch of the console that we got that game in the United States. Technically February '97. We're going to sneak it into the '96.
We played it in December, like the Japanese version.
The Japanese import.
It explained the 4 controllers.
Yeah, what really stands out about Mario 64 looking back, I mean, I raced a ton in that game, but it's battle mode, right? Like, that's what people really think about.
I miss it.
I know.
Where is it?
Rip battle
Mario
mode.
Kart.
Well,
I
battle
mean,
mode's
8
come
is
back
amazing.
a
It
few
just
times.
doesn't have
It's
it.
not as fun now.
Yeah.
I mean, just those 4 controller ports, that couch co-op, not co-op, the couch, punch my friend in the arm when he, gangs up on me instead of the other guy that's got more balloons, like many, many hours.
Do you ever go back and look at the televisions you actually played
It's
4
insane.
players?
My screen was like this
Like
big.
this big, yeah.
Each person's screen is, and then it also drops resolution for each one. It almost seems impossible. We all have much younger eyes than.
Yeah, the frame rate in Mario Kart 64 with 4 players is really terrible.
it's really
I mean,
hard to
it's
play.
like you can count the frames with your fingers.
That-
People
GoldenEye,
learn
it's
to play that
unbelievable,
way. With the twitching of the analog stick, like now you play it and you just feels like it's not even reacting, but it is. And if you learned how to play it,
You compensated for it. But yeah, we had such a good time. Every time there was a major first-party game for N64, it was an event. Everybody got together. The amount of hours that were wasted just at, back our parent company was Imagine Media. At Imagine playing these games every night. It's just insane.
Mario Kart 64, also notable for being the originator of the blue shell, for better or worse. So, thanks Mario Kart. It was actually a really interesting year for video games. The N64 launch was undoubtedly the big video game event in '96, but it's also the year that Resident Evil made its debut. It came out in March 1996, obviously directed by Shinji Mikami. And I guess if someone would have asked me, I would have known this, but I didn't put 2 and 2 together until doing research for History of Awesome that that game predates the dual analog controls
Yes,
by,
I knew that.
by like a while. So you had to play that game with the old digital D-pad when it came out.
it was terrible. Controlling the game with that D-pad was so difficult.
I mean, it's one of those things that's terrible in hindsight, but at the time,
that's true.
I
Yeah, at
know.
the time, I guess I
you
wouldn't
can
have
say
noticed.
like those tank controls did add a lot of tension because it wasn't so easy
I know
to
that
turn
argument.
around and like run for the door. And
Yeah.
the more you played that game, I think the more some folks at least got used to that.
for sure.
But I will never
So
forget
we-
that game because it was that B-movie acting. It was bloody as heck. I'd never seen a game like that before in my like young adult life. And then it was just this cheesy sort of mystery, but it was so atmospheric in that you walk into rooms, you find these notes from people who slowly turn zombie, and you read them and know exactly what happened.
Really creepy.
Was it couch co-op for you too? Because I never played that game alone. We always played with a friend.
Oh yeah.
And usually like I had already played the corridor with the dogs jumping in before, and then you're like, all right, you play this next part, and you're like, doo-doo-doo. It's like the equivalent of knowing what happens in Game of Thrones before it happens. You're just like, why don't you play this scene? It was so good.
Resident Evil wasn't the first survival horror game. You know, it's sort of like it depends on what you want to count. There are games like Alone in the Dark, but I mean, it wasn't the first, but it was kind of the one. Like it was the one that started. You know, we owe Silent Hill and just a huge gaming debt to Resident Evil. Things like, you know, de-emphasizing the combat, you know, an emphasis on sort of stifling controls, sort of that are
limitations left and
deliberately.
The camera angle was the big thing. You never knew what was around the corner, even though it was that close.
Or you could hear it,
you couldn't
but
see
you
it.
couldn't
And you're like,
see it.
I mean, also those pre-rendered backdrops were gorgeous by the standards of the time. You know, it let them do things with atmosphere, and again, you're right, positioning the camera in such a way that. Was genuinely creepy and horrifying. I don't know if you were to go back and play it now, how scary it would feel, but I mean...
No, that's fair. I mean, I've seen like essays written about how those little those camera setups are some like sort of weird, like it feels like you're almost part of an experiment being watched throughout the entire game.
Because it's like security camera angles.
Yeah, exactly, with some of them. And
it's voyeuristic.
Yeah, it added a ton of atmosphere to that game. And I will say to your point, when I played that game, I felt like it was the game that people around me who weren't into games would love to watch because they wouldn't know what was going to happen next, and neither would you. You'd sit there and be like, I hope that I'm going to kill this thing. Like, I don't know for sure.
It's like that clock haunts you too. Like you just see this clock, 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 clock the whole time, and you never know what's going to come next.
My favorite moment in that game, just before we move on, is that once you go back to the mansion the second time, and you're like, okay, well, I have this key, and now I can open all these doors I couldn't open before. I think it's the last key you need.
Yeah.
And then at that point in the game, Mikami introduces the Hunter, which is this like smaller, impish almost looking thing, but it has huge claws. It will just run up and swipe your head off. And so all that security and all that safety you felt as you were returning to a space that you visited before was completely gone.
That was so
and you were on your own.
So a couple other quick points about Resident Evil. One of the only Resident Evils that have multiple endings based on who you saved and whether you destroyed or didn't destroy the mansion. I think there's something like 6 endings in the game. It's also one of the most re-released or remade games. Obviously, the GameCube remake. They released the director's cut before they released the DualShock.
And it was terrible. The director's
PS1.
cut was awful because it made all these promises of uncut, like cut footage. None of it was cut footage.
No,
it was just the same game. I remember famously an EGM review where I think they gave it a 3.
Yeah.
Because it's like it's the same.
It wasn't a director's cut. They screwed it up.
Yeah, in that footage, like at the time, like there weren't games that had good acting. Like Symphony of the Night had come out, you know, and it's like we all like now it's like, oh, it's so funny and ironic that these people are in these cutscenes in Resident Evil and are so they're just dopey. It's like really
is
bad
so good. The original
acting.
FMV intro.
And all the voiceovers are really, or like Metal Gear is like this too. But like, there's a class of people that grew up with those and like totally like expected them to be like that's what the standard was, and it was awesome. But like I came to them a little bit later, and I always go back and be like, these games are so poorly done in that part of it, but hilarious for it.
Yeah,
and it's funny the two sides that people take with that.
Pretty decent. I say decent, but this is my memory. Maybe I would need to go back and check. Tomb Raider also came out in '96. Great year for video games. I remember Lara Croft's voice acting pretty good. She's a good, sort of English gentlewoman, but also happens to raid tombs. You touched on it a little bit earlier. That's what jumps out at me about that game is I don't know how I played it. Like it's almost impossible to control by modern standards.
It's a hard game to go back to. I will never forget though, sort of going through caves and just discovering these huge vistas. And the first thing that's going through my mind is like, how do I get from here to all the way down to the ground so I could just enter that temple? There was a sense of discovery that was still very fresh in that game.
It was absolutely a puzzle game masquerading, disguised as an action game.
You guys gotta mention the moment T-Rex. You come around the corner and it goes ding 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 ding, and there's the T-Rex, and you're like, what?
Yeah, that was a legitimate like holy cow moment.
It was just such a great surprise in that game where like you had so focused on making sure you don't kill that character, suddenly you had to worry about something.
It sort of continues. It sort of continues that Indiana Jones tradition of sort of a down-to-earth, grounded adventure game, but then there's some supernatural element in it. Not necessarily a twist, but once you saw that T-Rex, like you didn't know Like all doors were open at that point.
Yeah. No, I did enjoy that game because it made me use my brain a lot. Like I constantly remember just fumbling through, okay, what to do next? How do I sort of get through these puzzles? But going to Pear's point a little bit about combat, combat was not good, but it was made to look as flashy as possible, even though it wasn't good. Because think about it, you're backflipping, shooting through the air.
Yeah, that's great.
You're do things, bats.
Yeah, like you can vault to the side and shoot at things, and there's no way to really target it that well. So you're kind of like just firing bullets into the ether. Nothing.
I mean, the thing that people
whatever.
forget now, now that we have 15, 20 years later in the future, is that we were 12 months back from playing Genesis and Super Nintendo.
Oh yeah.
12 months ago, that was video games, and 12 months later, it's Tomb Raider and it's Mario 64, and that's just an absolutely incredible leap. And they were still figuring out how 3D games should look and feel and control.
Yeah, if you think about the last 3D games on the Super NES were like your Star Fox and Stunt Race FX, Wild Tracks, right? Like those games that ran at a really slow frame rate, had like single color polygon characters, and suddenly you get Mario 64. In the arcades, you got like Virtua Racing and Daytona, so it was just kind of kicking off this whole
Daytona.
3D.
An interesting thing about 1996 is that there was this weird parallel world going on in the world of PC gaming, and this is the year we got Quake. And I don't know, I mean, Per, maybe you played it. I wasn't a big PC gamer yet at that point. I wouldn't sort of have my PC enlightenment until a couple years later. Obviously, the follow-up to Doom, full 3D, sort of remembered for its insanely fast pace. Just a fast, blistering fast game. Its controls, sort of the bunny hopping and the rocket jumping. Like, it was just this brutal, fast experience, sort of unlike any other FPS.
Yeah, and it was interesting because you could already see kind of two different distinct audiences developing, right? Like Quake was all about LAN and online play. It really was one of those games that really sold you on the idea that you could have incredible fun playing against people you didn't know that were far away and not in the same room, right? Whereas like consoles then kind of went back to really being about couch combat and like 4-player with the N64. But and Quake also is one of those games where you thought, oh, our PC game's going to be more brown and gritty, right? Like it was very much kind of like the drab realism of the real world, whereas like console games were crazy with color at the time.
I kind of remember it as the crisis of its day. Would you say that? Like, can it run? Can my PC run Quake? Was the question.
Yeah, that was the big question.
The height of the technology.
And you started to worry about networks too, and it was hard to set up that stuff at the time.
The Quake World Online service was transformative. It was one of the first games, along with Ultima Online, that really made online play, a thing that was in the consciousness of gamers. Like I said, there's always examples of something earlier that did it, but Quake and Ultima are the two games that sort of set that tone. Quake's netcode was designed with like LAN play in mind, and then when people started to play over dial-up modems, unbelievably, they had to rewrite. John Carmack himself, is largely responsible for rewriting this code that did things like, predictive movements to sort of hide the latency and make Quake playable online on these dial-up modems with huge ping, and made the game sort of into the phenomenon that it would be for decades to come.
Yeah, I don't know how you would even play a LAN game if you weren't in college in a dorm.
Yeah.
Like, who had access to LAN games in their normal life? Like in high school, I would have never had that.
The other sort of big takeaway with Quake is that engine, would become the foundation for Call of Duty, for the Source engine, for Half-Life, for Medal of Honor, for Rage, all these sort of things. Their family tree can be traced all the way back to Quake. So even if you never really played that game,
was the engine called the Quake engine?
It's embarrassing that I don't remember. I just
remember that was the first time I
think
heard
it was.
the
I think
term
it was.
engine.
I think it was IdTech. I think is the engine. I'm actually not positive.
Yeah.
There were a lot of other notable video games that came out that year. We had games like, where are my notes? Duke Nukem 3D, Super Mario RPG, Diablo, but unfortunately we do need to move on to some of the movies, the films that came out in 1996. Probably the biggest, not the biggest, the biggest in terms of box
office. It was a blockbuster
office.
year, right?
It was an absolutely massive year for action films, including Independence Day came out.
That's right. That was big.
This movie made $800 million.
Yeah. And was the beginning of coming up with cute, marketable terms like ID4.
Yeah.
And, just the abbreviation obsession.
I mean, and it came out on Independence Day, started that twin for Will Smith that lasted a few years.
And I think the Earth got destroyed like yearly, frequently after that. It was a big Earth disaster
Emmerich
movie.
destructions.
Exactly. That movie was directed by Roland Emmerich, and it was sort of the start of, he'd done Stargate before, but this was the start of him just destroying the Earth in 2012 and The Day After Tomorrow, and that sort of became his trademark. they were so smart to use just that image of the White House exploding was in every commercial, everything. It was just inescapable.
So iconic.
And it let you know that like this movie's not effing around. Like before you saw it, you're like, wow. Like it's sort of trite by today's standards, but at the time, like
I still enjoy it. I mean, it is cheesy, right? Like hacking into alien technology with your Mac, all that kind of stuff.
Area 51.
It had the typical like the character archetypes, which go back to the 70s disaster movies like Earthquake and all that, right?
Yeah,
but
it's
some
really good performances. Bill Pullman, Will Smith,
Goldblum,
Jeff Goldblum. It was a really good roster of in terms of like
Didn't it have like Data from Star Trek Next Generation as the scientist, right?
Who played Jeff Goldblum's father? Because he was also really awesome in that movie.
the old guy.
He's from Taxi, but anyway.
But it also had ridiculous moments, right? Like the final battle was
there's no defending the uploading the virus to the alien mothership.
Or flying the
jets into the shields of the.
Did you ever see the original ending, which had the double-decker? The crop duster guy was flying a double-decker, so it's an alternate.
I saw that.
And they even thought it was too ridiculous, so they have him fly a jet.
Yeah.
So
what do you mean flying?
he's a quick learner.
What's a double-decker?
Like a
crop
biplane.
dusting, like biplane. But let us not overlook a very important thing that happened because of that movie was Star Fox. There's a level in Star Fox that is a complete homage to
and you can go inside it, right?
The free-roaming level with the giant UFO. That's a different one.
No, that's a different one. But
it has the big mothership that was totally based on ID4.
Yeah, that entire shot was ID4.
The ID4 effects look dated by today's standards. Revolutionary for the time, a combination of practical effects and special effects. Won the Academy Award for visual effects that year.
Wow.
That movie made $800 million in 1996 bucks, which is who knows how much money by today's standards.
Wow.
And yet, oddly, there was no sequel for 20 years. And they are making one now. But it's just unbelievable that there wasn't Independence Day 2 and 3 and 4 and 5.
I don't know. The way that story worked, I don't think it was possible to make. Like, it didn't feel like a movie that had the potential for a sequel.
Still out there.
Yeah,
I think they're still out there. No, but that was also a discovery of the kind of the modern era of effects, right? Like we're getting into people making dinosaur movies and all that kind of stuff. And I think just there wasn't the need to go back to the well that often and recycle.
Yeah.
Sure.
Big clever thing in that movie. Revealing the aliens at the end and what they looked like.
Yeah.
Like how they kept that secret. Like who is in those ships? They keep that a secret.
For a while.
They don't ever show. And then they show a big armored thing, right? But then it's not that.
It's a tiny alien inside.
Love that.
Another big action movie that came out was Mission Impossible.
The Brian De Palma one.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That movie's directed by Brian De Palma, who is a true heavyweight. I mean, Carrie, Scarface, Carlito's Way, making this sort of big blockbuster action movie.
Yeah.
It was. I love that movie when it first came out, but I gotta say, like plot-wise, I was watching it. I'm like, what? What's going on?
It's
like
really
really
I couldn't follow it, but it had so many amazing set pieces, and like I thought Tom Cruise was great in it. I wasn't a big fan of turning an iconic character from the TV show into the bad guy, for example. It's
funny that people forget. I mean, the term Mission Impossible, everyone thinks about the movies more than the show now, but you're totally right.
It was a show reboot.
Well, I know, but there was a huge controversy when the movie came out that they sort of assassinated the character of this hero from the show. Yeah,
that was a
did
bummer.
the first one have the face masks in it?
Yeah,
that was so funny. And then, of course,
good.
parodied in Austin Powers. But I loved that because they looked so perfect that you totally couldn't have worked.
The gadgets were the best part for me. Like they were up there with GoldenEye for me in terms of what they could do with like gadgets and like the chewing gum
safe room
that you put down.
Yes, and they had Jean Reno flying a helicopter into a tunnel.
Yeah.
So
you remember that chasing the train?
Sorry, just last thing. Not John Voight.
That was John Voight.
No, it was another character who's in that movie. He's bald. I'm forgetting, but he was like the guy that was in every movie. I feel like he played sort of the hacker on the team who was infiltrating on computers. I don't know.
Jeff Goldblum?
No, definitely not Jeff Goldblum. Go ahead.
I think so. It's interesting that each Mission Impossible,
Ving Rhames.
Ving Rhames,
Ving Rhames.
Different director for each movie and a very different feel. Like the original Mission Impossible is very much a spy movie. There are no gunfights in it. Ethan Hunt actually never fires a gun in the movie. And it was also, Tom Cruise wasn't famous for this yet, but he did all of his own stunts. He was already that guy.
So he did that in Mission Impossible, huh?
Yeah, he was already, gung-ho. In order to make the train, that big set piece at the end of the movie look convincing, they sort of got this gigantic fan that would blow in his face and sort of deform his face.
It's when you think of Jurassic Park and the James Bond franchise, there's like that music that makes the moment. And like the moment he says red light, green light, and like bam, chewing gum goes on the helicopter.
It's so good.
goosebump. You know, it's like it's such a great goosebump moment.
I think partially because of De Palma's directing, I think Mission Impossible absolutely holds up, in my opinion.
I like that movie.
It's a great spy movie.
That sort of iconic, lowering of the wires, sort of. First of all, that
computer
scene,
hack,
that scene lasts a really long time. Like I didn't time it with a stopwatch, but it's like over 10 minutes of film time.
The sweat too, as it drops. Catching it. Oh.
It's so like it doesn't make any sense if you think about it, but like if you're just like as movie magic, it's incredible.
Yeah, still going strong, that franchise.
Yeah, you want to talk about a good year for action movies? This is also the year that we saw The Rock come out.
Oh my God!
Directed by Michael Bay, sort of before he went full Michael Bay on the world.
That's a pretty Michael Bay movie.
No, he went full Michael
I
Bay.
think that's the
end,
one.
I watched that movie recently with my kids. They were laughing the entire time. They're like, "Why is the Temple of Doom underneath Alcatraz?"
Totally. I like how it's all about bath beads.
Huh?
There's those like weird bath beads that are like that hold
for the bomb
weapon.
Don't the cable cars also blow up and stuff?
Yeah, no, San Francisco gets wrecked in like
Do
the
they
first
really?
15 minutes of that
All
movie.
right, I'm willing to concede all that. I'm just saying, compared to what was to follow,
Sunset.
It's it's
Yeah.
no Armageddon or Pearl Harbor or
No,
Transformers.
definitely.
It sort of continues that tradition of very vulnerable heroes started by Die Hard. The Nick Cage, the unlikely action hero. Stanley Goodspeed, fantastic name for a character.
Yeah. No, and Sean Connery,
Max
like,
Power.
even though you could say he kind of phoned in his role a little bit in that movie, he was still very, very good in that movie.
I like the
With the
fan. I like
long
the
hair
fan
in the
theory that
beginning.
he's James Bond.
Yeah.
He's basically playing. He's
yeah.
he's a British agent
That's
in that
cool.
film.
Yeah, they got caught. Yeah.
There's a bunch of things that I actually like about The Rock. At the time it came out, it got mixed reviews, but its sort of esteem has grown in the couple decades since, and it's now sort of seen as one of the better action movies from the era. Ed Harris plays the villain, and he's actually very, very sympathetic, incredibly
likable,
well written.
Yeah.
He's got a very solid, reasonable motivation for why he's
Blowing up
turned
everybody.
for blowing up
Yeah.
everybody.
That movie also inspired games, because I remember, I think it's Call of Duty 3 or Call of Duty 2, but the prison shower essentially gets brought up in another Call of Duty, and it's that same
remember
sort of
that.
scene where they're getting shot at and you have to kind of fight your way back out.
That movie
Iconic,
has like remarkable aerial shots. There's like these great establishing shots.
I mean, they
where
filmed
they're
at
just, like,
Alcatraz, which is kind of unbelievable in and of
Yeah,
itself.
that's unusual too. I need to see it now that I live here. I just realized, like,
Yeah,
man,
that and
Hitler
Mrs.
lived in San
Doubtfire are like the
Francisco.
two movies you have to watch if you live in San Francisco.
I would say that and Dirty Harry, maybe. Maybe stay away from Mrs.
Watching The Rock now, you realize they are doing stunts in the streets.
Yeah.
And you wonder how they got away with it.
They
Yeah, that
filmed
is
that
They
scene,
surprising.
wreck so much. in
that scene of the
movie.
FBI guy Womack being dangled over the edge of the
yes.
Fairmont Hotel was
Love
filmed
that.
at the Fairmont, and people were calling the cops.
Oh, really?
What's going on?
See a guy being dangled over.
Yeah.
That hotel is so high up and so high up on a hill already.
Yeah.
That'd be a terrifying scene to shoot.
We and again, I didn't time it with a stopwatch, but that movie has a really, really long time before they get to Alcatraz. There's like an hour of running
Yeah.
time. There's a whole prologue with Goodspeed and them stealing the poison, and then all the stuff, basically wrecking San Francisco. And then it's a long time before they even get to the island, which I thought was not necessarily a brave decision, but it's just an interesting.
They also do this, they do this little tourism thing where they show you Alcatraz inside. You see the tour go through.
Oh, it's great.
And they get locked in the cells. Like, there's a lot of setup in there. Of
course.
And then everything blows up in sunset.
We all regret now that made Nick Cage into an action star.
Oh man,
That didn't make sense. Face
Rock's-
Off came after that.
The Rock's really good. I have a total soft spot for it.
Oh, I'll never forget that
We don't need to spend a tremendous amount of time on it, but we do need to touch on sort of '96 being maybe the height of the Adam Sandler era.
Oh, yeah.
Of just him printing money. Like we had Billy Madison in '95, Happy Gilmore in '96, The Waterboy and Wedding Singer in '98, and Big Daddy in '99. That's like
So 96 was his best year.
Yeah.
Happy Gilmore is probably the peak
That's
in my
the best
opinion.
movie,
Yeah.
right?
So here's the interesting thing. I've always had it in my head that Adam Sandler comedies were good and then got bad. But then before we came in here to film, I'm like, I want to look at the Metacritic average, and they've always been bad.
Yeah, we just liked them
I
at the
like
time
him.
when he was really popular.
Well, because that's my thing. Like maybe he's just making movies for 13 to 16-year-old boys, and that's the age
well, that
that
SNL cast was special, right?
Yeah.
And they were all involved in those movies, and it's great seeing an Adam Sandler movie in that time because he came off such a good run on SNL.
Yeah.
He was an SNL superstar, and that's why we liked his comedy at the time, not because he was a movie star.
I mean, I do think
He's a great comedian.
I think that even though the movies weren't reviewed well then, and his movies aren't aren't well reviewed now. Again, maybe I'm biased just
Justifiably
because
so.
I saw them when I was young, but like
Oh, yeah.
I feel like Happy Gilmore and Billy Madison are so quotable. And these moments that you maybe don't even remember from those movies. He's like, I award you no points and may God have mercy on your soul.
Yeah, but they were fresh at the time. Like you
Yeah.
hadn't. It was kind of like you liked his shtick from Saturday
That's
Night
it.
Live,
Yeah.
so you liked seeing it again. But then year in, year out, you get
Yeah.
that same thing just applied to different sports, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
That's not what
then,
you
then it
guys
stopped
are
being cute. To me, at least, I really like the early movies. And
Safe date movies, right?
If pee in your pants is cool, then consider me Miles Davis. That was always one of my favorites. Happy Gilmore is also notable for having maybe one of the top 10 cameos of all time with Bob Barker at the end of that movie.
And he delivers a beatdown in Bob Barker fashion.
I don't know
that
who
no one
Bob
thought.
Barker is. This is
Yes,
some
you do. The
American
Price is
stuff.
Right
in there.
guy.
I never grew up with that.
Okay.
Yeah, he's the
we just
host
watched
of The
Knight
Price
Rider
is
in
Right.
Germany.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
all we
yeah.
had.
He has a tiny microphone
all
that's
day.
really thin, and he holds it like this, and he says to spay and neuter your pets at the end of
this
every
time-
episode.
If you hadn't explained it, I would have thought Bob Barker was a character from Lassie.
We're running out of time, but
You know Alf, though, right?
Yes.
Another very notable movie that came out in 1996, and it's very much a product of that era, is Scream.
Oh yeah.
Oh wow.
Directed by Wes.
That old?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Wes
that's
Craven
old.
sort of revitalized his career for the first revitalization. He would have a second one later, and revitalized horror in general. That genre had been sort of sliding downhill into
yeah.
direct-to-video sort of schlock, and Scream brought it back big time.
Yeah, it was meta. It had broke the fourth wall, and
Yep.
it was really
Right.
interesting.
It was this interesting.
It
So
was a horror movie about horror movies.
Yep.
that's the thing. It's a horror movie where people live in a universe where horror movies exist and are aware of the tropes, and very self-aware. Almost, I mean, it's not a comedy. It's incredibly dark and violent.
yeah.
and
David
had to-
Arquette's in it. It has to be a comedy. No,
Totally,
I'm kidding.
you're right.
I'm kidding.
But I mean, that movie
You're right,
almost
you're
got an NC-17 rating for how sort of disturbing parts of it were.
Well, the opening is terrifying. Like,
Yeah.
her at home alone. I mean, it's sort of a tropey scenario, but it was still like really well shot, really well sort of presented. Drew Barrymore, unfortunately, dies within the first 10 minutes of that movie.
But that's shocking, right? I mean,
yeah, no.
You don't expect that,
I
yeah.
will say, like, it did come on the heels of like years of just horror movie after horror movie. There was Friday the 13th. There was Nightmare on
Yeah.
Elm Street. There were so many series that.
Yeah.
And the formula was always the same, right? So it was
It's
really
don't
smart.
go in there. Like you're always
Yeah,
saying,
but
why
they
are you
always
going
go
in there? Right?
Yeah, so it was really smart to see a movie make fun of it, but also still improve on it.
It mocked those horror conventions while still sort of embracing them.
And then
But I will say the ending was super disappointing when you find out it's just those two stupid kids,
Yeah,
like
that was
in
dumb.
some pact to kill everything. Like I just
Yeah.
was like, okay, this is dumb.
what I also think it's notable for the mask, right? It's like a take on the painting, the Scream, like the Munch painting, right?
Or Michael Myers,
And it's-
which had a very iconic mask.
Yeah,
as well.
exactly. But they basically took like the ridiculous concept of like the scary mask. It's like, oh, it's just a hockey mask, but now it's scary.
Yeah.
And then they made it deliberately this scary Halloween mask and applied it to a killer, right?
I mean, it's-
now kids run around on Halloween with
Yeah.
that mask. I always wonder if they've seen the movie.
Oh,
or
they
if it's
have.
just
Yeah,
Well, it
most
also,
no, it's
I mean,
just
it's hard.
an icon.
As more time has passed, I'm not even sure the picture behind us is from Scream. It might be from Scary Movie. Like, I sort of think it's
Totally.
almost a little funny, right? But like
Yeah.
the movie was genuinely disturbing and
was.
creepy. And one thing I didn't know until just sort of looking up some trivia was that Scream, up until right before it came out, was called Scary Movie. That was going to be the
really?
name of the movie because
That's
sort of
hilarious.
playing up that self-awareness aspect of
Scary
it.
movies, yeah.
That would have been strange.
We don't actually, unfortunately, one of my History of Awesome doesn't get a chance to talk about books as much as I would like, but we sort of have to spend, sort of before we sign off, just a couple minutes talking about Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
We all read it that year, right?
I mean,
The
that's
actual
Nobody
Game
read
of
it.
Thrones, because the other books are not called
right.
that.
The
Yeah.
book, A
First
Game of
book in A
Thrones,
Song
the
of Ice
first
and
book
Fire.
in A Song of Ice and Fire, came out in 1996. It was a success at launch. It sold a lot of copies, but it wouldn't hit the New York Times bestseller list until 15 years later. Until 2011 is when that game became sort of a true massive
Yeah, book.
blockbuster. Yeah, excuse me.
Yeah, with the show, or even before the show.
Yeah, like it was this perfect.
The
The
show
launched,
brought it back.
Well,
Because-
but it became a bestseller before the show. Like it
Yeah.
was sort of climbing. Like the books were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the first book didn't hit the
so
New York
it
Times
was right
bestseller
before the
list.
show came
Yeah.
out?
Yeah, and I remember it went around IGN.
The show was
too. It
perfectly timed.
The
Really?
book went viral before the show was announced. Like before we even thought they would ever turn this into a show, because it seemed like impossible, right? Like
Yeah.
it's Lord of the Rings scale, and like you couldn't imagine that many
lot of
books being turned
murdering,
into it.
yeah.
It went kind of viral in the office. Like one person told the other, and
Yeah.
like everybody started to read it. By the end,
That's cool.
we had all read the books before the show came out.
So fantasy, I read a lot of fantasy, and so I say this with the utmost love, but fantasy is sort of prissy elves, and you have to get the magic staff, and you have to, that's what it was. Like, it was this very sort of clean and dry, you know, the heroes
War
were
of the
goody
Roses,
two-shoes. Yeah. And Game of Thrones is what really brought dark, gritty fantasy, sort of grim, dark fantasy to the forefront, and it allowed, you know, books from people like Brent Weeks and Jim Butcher, and it sort of kicked off this fantasy wave that we're still riding to this day, 20 years later.
And it pulled no punches in the first 2 chapters. I mean, the first chapter is a murder, as expected, and then the second, you were sort of witnessing one character embrace his duty, but he had to kill someone. And his kids were there.
Say what you want about the later Game of Thrones books. You know, Sam, I know you like them a lot,
Big fan.
but what I like
You like
about
the last ones?
Yeah.
what I like about the original Game of
The most recent
Thrones
one's great,
is that
last 300 pages.
the original Game of Thrones is a mystery. Like, who killed Jon Arryn? And like, it's really interesting to just see, you know, Ned Stark sort of going around and investigating this mystery. Like,
and it's a political murder too.
Yeah.
So
It
it
had
has
this
like this
overarching-
weird political intrigue that's normally not in a fantasy book.
it's telling. I feel like at this point the books are just sort of then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. But the first book has like an arc that it's following where you're sort of peeling back the layers of this onion in a really interesting way.
I mean, it felt like you had these. You felt like you understood the world, and you're like, oh yeah, I get it. Jamie's bad, right? And he's the main character, and he's the second. And like, when the book was halfway over, everything was completely changed. The characters you hated, you started to like, but you felt like it was like this set world still, and like. Even though it had an appendix with like every character name, because you needed a phone book to read this book, right, to understand. But then after that first book, I think things changed a lot, and like
Well,
new
you know they did
factions
because
came
he
in,
wrote
like
that
the
letter to his
Greyjoys.
editor that got completely changed. Remember that, the plot line? What's really funny about early pressing, well, it's still pressed almost the same way, but if you look at that book, it is so low budget looking. The map inside, it looks like it was made on like a Macintosh in 1988.
Yeah, I have that.
Yeah, it's so funny. And then it's just like the pressing's really cheap. It's cheap paperback. It's like everything about that book is like low budget fantasy. So it's so cool to see its
It was
meteoric rise
called
to
A
popularity.
Song of Ice and Fire,
I know,
right?
it's
Like
all
which,
and his name, George R.R. Martin.
Yeah.
I mean, come
J.R.R.
on. Like you
Tolkien.
would never pick that book up on the shelf if somebody didn't tell you to.
really spread by word of mouth. I mean, seriously.
And you got to
Absolutely.
think how many other sleeper fantasy and sci-fi books are there out there?
I mean, it's
that are
just
gonna
great
get
to
picked
see
up
it
in the next
elevate
15 years?
sci-fi and
Read The
fantasy
Martian.
to these new heights. Read The Martian. Guys, there was so much more awesome stuff in 1996. As I said, video games like Mario RPG and Diablo, movies like Space Jam and From Dusk Till Dawn, just really rad stuff. But unfortunately,
Space Jam.
I know, but it's like
Did you just throw that in there?
yeah, I threw it out there. Space Jam, like
Blockbuster,
Space
man.
Jam,
Walked out
like
of that
Scream,
one.
is very much a product of the mid '90s.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
you
Bill
can't do
Murray?
that again.
So we are at a time we're trying to keep these episodes as we could just keep going on and on and on. But guys, thank you for joining me. Next year is 1997. Do we know what was that year? Do you have any ideas?
GoldenEye.
Final Fantasy VII.
Oh my goodness gracious. So guys, we have much more awesomeness coming up. So stay tuned to the History of Awesome.